psychology, we specialize in several types of psychological or psychoeducational assessment. Today, and on this video, Larissa Predy and Ashton Parker talk about the types of assessment and the things you can expect from an assessment process.
Assessment in psychology can mean a lot of different things. There are different variations. So as assessment psychologists, we specifically call ourselves that because we were trained in school psychology. And school psychology means that we do testing for things like learning disabilities, intellectual disabilities, neurobehavioral, childhood developmental diagnoses. And so that goes across the lifespan still. But there are a few limitations. In the world of school psychology, we do specialize sort of in that area of anything that applies to your learning or your kind of academic work-life success. We at Little Oaks also specialize in psychiatric diagnoses. So we do personality, neurobehavioral things like ADHD, and that is all incorporated into school psychology realm, but not every school psychologist necessarily goes that route, so we've taken some different specializations here at Little Oaks. And so we're going to talk about all those different options today. And what is assessment? I mean, I think that sort of broadly touches on it, but there's so much to it, obviously. I mean, this is something we spend our careers doing, and with a single client could mean 10 to 18 hours of time. So there's lots to talk about. And we have 30 minutes.
It's comprehensive.
It's for sure. Yeah. So do you want to just maybe touch on that? Like, how would you answer that question if someone came in and said, okay, I'm here, I'm booked for an assessment appointment, but what is that? I don't actually know what that means.
Right. So maybe I'll get into a little bit about the process, I guess, of an assessment. So typically we like to have here an intake interview where we would sit down with clients and talk about really what their goals are for an assessment. And sometimes you might not know when you come to that initial intake interview, so it's really our job to figure out what the purpose of that assessment would be for you and how that might change things for you or your child. And so we would use that initial intake interview to gather a lot of information and to make decisions with you about whether or not to go forward with an assessment. And then if we did decide together to go ahead with that assessment, then we would start collecting information or data. So we would be going about that a few different ways. So potentially more clinical interviews with parents or teachers or the child, adults, whoever's involved. Also questionnaires being filled out by multiple different people. We'd have the testing sessions where we would be one-on-one doing some different diagnostic tests and different standardized measures. And then we would basically, as assessment psychologists, take all of that information together along with like report cards and previous assessment reports and things like that to be able to write up a report, sit down and have a results meeting with you and talk about all of the results, any diagnoses if there are any, recommendations kind of regardless of a diagnosis of how to support at home, at school, at work, in the community. And then we would kind of sit down and go over all of that together. So in a nutshell, that's a really quick kind of look at what the assessment process is of a more formal kind of assessment that we would do here at Little Oaks.
Yeah. Once we get, when I get a bit more tech savvy, I'll figure out how I can like put things on this screen. Maybe someone could tell me. You could send me messages and be like, here's how to be a tech-savvy person. But we have a visual that we often use that we created as an infographic, I guess, about what assessment looks like, and that's on our website. So if you are interested, there's a resources page on our website, and that has sort of like a visual, what would an assessment look like. But the way Ashton just explained it, I think the one thing that really is important, something that I think that we really need to draw out is this idea that we take multiple sources of information and that all of those come together with our clinical knowledge and our background and the research. Like sometimes we're even like looking into new research and new literature like during an assessment because we're trying to see what is fitting, what's making sense for this child and so or adult. And All of that kind of formulation goes into the report. So you get this, well, in our reports anyways, I mean, we can't speak for every psychologist, but for sure in our reports, we're really comprehensive. There's these 22 to 32 page reports that hopefully people read one day, and have all the details that you're kind of maybe looking for, that you have questions about what's been going on for my kid or what's been going on for me, and that's causing me difficulties in learning or dealing with my I guess like workplace, could be dealing with social relationships, right? Like any kind of questions that are potentially could have an underlying answer of a cognitive or developmental reason. Yeah. I hope that's not too broad. I feel like it's like an answer that's direct, but sometimes we give direct answers that are direct because we have this huge background in psychology. So I mean, please send questions. Send me like information if you're curious about something or we're not touching on what you're looking for.
I think something that would be important to know just about the assessment process is that it's not like a one appointment thing and then it's done, right? So it really is a comprehensive, I would say time intensive also. And so, you know, you're looking at least a few visits to the office before you're going to have an assessment report in your hand, and that can take a little bit of time to kind of get that going and get everything scheduled. And so it is a bit of a process, but our hope is always that it's useful in the end and that it's giving you the answers and you know, the recommendations and the support that you're looking for.
Yeah, I think that's a good point too, is that so those, when we say 10 to 18 hours, a lot of that is our formulation and report writing time. Not a lot, but a few of those hours at least, right? So, and then those times with clinical interviewing. So if it's a child assessment, they might be in the office for 3 hours and not in one chunk. Usually we spread that out. And so, you know, it's not as exhausting as it maybe sounds. And usually kids have fun, right?
Yeah.
Like the assessments themselves, we're looking at thinking abilities, problem solving, puzzles, patterns, words, sounds, all kinds of fun stuff. And we're really encouraging and enthusiastic, and they get a prize when they leave, right? So they're usually pretty happy to be here. And it's not like school in that way, right? If that child is already struggling at school, they're not dreading coming in here quite as much because it's only for an hour and they're going to get, you know, a rubber ball when they leave or whatever prize they choose. But the other thing I think that you mentioned too about just that comprehensiveness. So one of the questions that we have is like, what's the point basically of assessment? Like, why do I want to do this? And I think what you've touched on is this idea that like we are looking to give answers so that you can either access supports, access funding and intervention through school systems or public systems. We are hoping to, with that report, be able to give you a tool in your hands that you can say, here's what I need, to a team of professionals or your school team or whoever, so that you can access the supports that you need. At Little Oaks, we are very comprehensive in our recommendations. So, you know, we even have like a caveat that we tell people. We're like, don't feel like you have to do all of these because there's a lot of them, but we want to give as many strategies and recommendations as you can, because the whole purpose of doing an assessment is to move forward with this information and access the things that are important for your unique profile of needs.
Yeah. And I think too, in addition to accessing supports and services, I will often hear from parents that they just want to have a better understanding of what's going on for their child, because it might actually change, you know, how they conceptualize their child's difficulties and therefore also how they are responding to it. So they might, you know, if they realize that their child does have ADHD or does have a learning disability, they might have a little bit more empathy towards them when they're really struggling or when they're having more behavioral difficulties around homework time or something like that.
Yeah, that's lovely. And I do think that's a sentiment that comes out in a lot of our feedback meetings, right? In our results meetings, is we say, you know, here's what's going on for your child. And I mean, the thing we're looking for, because we want to be answering accurate things, like we want to be providing the right answers. And when a parent sits there and goes, oh my gosh, yes, right? Like, that's the moment that I love. I like work for every assessment is
Yeah.
that moment that I'm looking for, right? Because we want you to have the answers to go home with, that you feel like, I know now what my next steps are. I know what the goals can be.
Yeah.
And what's reasonable to expect from this profile, right?
And as we're describing the results in that session, you should really feel like, oh, they really get my kid. Like, they really took the time to understand me or understand my child, and what they're saying is really resonating with me. So I think that, if we did our job correctly in the comprehensiveness of our assessments, you won't really feel like there's any big surprises probably, and you'll really feel like there might be some things that you didn't think about or didn't think kind of in the same way that we are, but it should sound like your child.
Yes, absolutely. Last week I had a parent who said to me, it feels like you've known my kid for years. And I was like, that's music to my ears, right? Because that's obviously what we want, is we're not trying to place something that doesn't make sense for that child. We're not trying to give you recommendations that are like, go seek this help, and you're kind of going, wait, that doesn't feel like what I need, right? We're taking all of that information, including the reason that you came in, right? So if you're coming in for an assessment, you're wondering about something. There's some question, right? And we take that question and we work outward from that. So we're hopefully going to answer whatever that one question is when you come back, right, for the results. In that same vein, there is a question that we often get, and I don't know, I have the way that I respond, but maybe you have another way. But when people say, okay, well, if I'm having difficulty with something, maybe socially, or something with my, schooling or something, should I just do counseling? Do I actually need assessment? Do I need a diagnosis? What do you say to someone like that?
I think usually, like, if we feel like it's a really immediate need where they are needing support to begin with, and they can't wait, for the time that it would take to complete an assessment, that would be a reason for maybe going a counseling route first, or maybe doing counseling and an assessment at the same time. But other than that, if you think that an assessment could maybe help you understand why you are having those difficulties, and maybe there is a diagnosis, maybe there's not, but maybe it's more just better understanding the way that you process information, or the way that you cope with information or emotions, then I think going the counseling or going the assessment route might make a lot of sense. So I think a question that probably several of us often ask is, what is an assessment going to change for you? Or what will this diagnosis potentially that you're looking for change for you?
I love that one, especially when it comes to diagnoses like ADHD, autism, because with autism is an interesting thing, because there are the kids who, it's fairly apparent that there's difficulties, right? And then there's the other kids who, as they're getting a little bit older, they're having social difficulties, they're not quite connecting. Maybe you're just noticing some differences in how they kind of process information. Maybe academically, they're not really getting to the heart of what they're being asked. There's different little red flags that we are picking up on, and we're going, something's up here, right? Or you're an adult, and as an adult, you're going, I read about autism, and I'm going, hello, this is me. And we get those people who come in for those adult assessments as well, right? And then that question, do I need a diagnosis, is actually something that we might pose too, right? For an adult, because we're not able to access funding in the same way as adults, right? So for children, you might be able to access family and child service supports. You might be able to get respite for your child. So you can have a break sometimes. You might be able to access kind of different funding for resources and supports and interventions and behaviorists, right? But as an adult, it's just a label, right? Like, there's not a lot that you're going to get out of that. So, but we still get people who are really curious, and why not, right? And in my mind, I see the reason, because they're going, there is something, and I think there's a reason that ties all of the challenges that I've had together. Right? And so to find out if there is something that kind of helps merge all of the challenges you faced in your life, so that you can feel maybe even like group connectedness and cohesion with other people who have like-mindedness or similarities, that can be really powerful.
Yeah.
But it is something we ask with adults, right? Because it can be also risky. Like, do you want this? Like, if this is the outcome, if this is a diagnosis that gets made, how are you going to feel about that, right? And it's something we want to be sure to do with good awareness. Because if it's not that, it could be something else.
Totally.
And we want to make sure you're prepared for that too.
Yeah.
Right? With kiddos, we do talk a lot about, and maybe we can do this another week because I think it kind of goes on a tangent. We were talking about trying not to go too tangenty because we love this area, right? This is our passion area. And so it's hard not to talk about all the things all at once. But with kids, something that we'll maybe address in another session is, do you tell them about a diagnosis? Mm-hmm. And how do we talk to them about diagnosis? And so that's a really great question that a lot of families have. And so maybe we could even spend a whole session next time talking about that.
Yeah.
Another thing that I tell people when they're asking about if I should just go to counseling, so I really like your approach. Is this an immediate need? Like, do you really need to address this issue immediately with counseling? Or could you wait because counseling can potentially be more direct and streamlined if we already know going into counseling what we're actually dealing with and what are the areas that we want to treat, right? And so an assessment can set you up to sort of start on counseling at a more advanced level, if that makes sense, right? Because there's a lot of awareness and self-awareness and direction for the counselors that comes out of a psychological assessment.
Yeah.
And so it's just deciding that. The other thing is obviously finances, mm-hmm. right? Because an assessment is a fairly costly thing. I mean, they range from like $2,000 to $3,000 pretty much, right? But your insurance potentially covers it, right? If you have benefits, extended benefits through work, or I don't know what other kind of funding we have for it. Really, I think it's just extended benefits, right? So you have to see your plan and see what you're covered. It's a psychological service.
Yeah.
So if you're covered for any psychological services, then you have coverage for assessment. Yeah. Unless your benefits package says otherwise, which usually they don't. Yeah. Usually it's just broad stroke psychological service. So if you're limited to how many dollars you have for psychological services, and we think, based on the things that you've come in your first initial intake, that we kind of have some direction for you already, and we go, you know what, we're thinking it's probably going to be this. For a full diagnosis, we need the full assessment, but if instead you want to use your dollars now to go through counseling, that's what we would advise, right? Mm-hmm. So we will let you know if we think that's appropriate.
Yeah.
And hopefully most people do that, right? Hopefully most psychologists, most companies will do that. But, yeah. The other thing, I guess, is how long. I think we touched on how long does it take.
Yeah.
But we could maybe delve into that a little bit deeper in that, we typically have about 4 to 6 weeks in our clinic as a time frame for start to finish. And that's assuming that appointments are booked on time and not canceled or moved or things don't come up, right? Things look a little different right now with the pandemic. When we're doing in-person testing, we do have a plexiglass thing now and all kinds of fun PPE that we had to get creative with, but all still possible for standardization.
Yeah.
As far as timing goes, if someone gets sick, we obviously have to postpone for a couple weeks, right? So that can change the timeline. So right now is a good time, I guess, right? Because if you're going back to school in September and you're needing that assessment for September, just knowing that there might be gaps, you might want to access an assessment sooner than later just to make sure that it gets done. But talk to your school system too, right? Because they might have you on a list to get an assessment through the schools, so that's important to know.
And to know when that might be likely to happen if you are on the list, and
mm-hmm.
kind of deciding whether or not you are able to wait.
Yeah. A question I get, Ashton, is parents who say, I've heard about standardized testing, mm-hmm. and I thought that it's not good.
Yeah.
How do you talk to parents about that?
Yeah, so the standardized testing that we do is definitely different than what you've probably heard about in a traditional school setting. So the standardized testing that we're doing is based on more on not on curriculum outcomes like it would be in a school necessarily, or like the standardized testing that they're aware of and they're doing. It's really focused on they know what the outcomes are that they're measuring on that standardized assessment, and then teachers are often teaching because they know what that standardized testing is going to ask or going to look at. Whereas here, we often do age-based norms and sometimes grade-based norms too. So we're really looking at where your child is functioning in terms of their learning skills, so their cognition, their ability to process different information, different kinds of memory, as well as those academic skills in reading and writing and math, how they're comparing to other kids of their same age, usually is our go-to, but then sometimes also where they're at in their same grade. And so we often use Canadian norms, or we try to use Canadian norms for our kids. So
when they're available.
So they're compared, ideally kids and individuals are compared to other individuals their same age in Canada, so that we get a more representative look at where they're supposed to be and where they are relative to that.
Yeah. So the standardized testing that's kind of been poo-pooed in the media is usually when they do testing in schools for like a grade level
it's like a provincial
exams, those kinds of things. And because every child's getting the same exact assessment, there's a lot of question about whether that is an appropriate tool to measure success and performance, right? Because learners are different. I mean, that's the point of our assessments, is showing the differences in learning styles. But in the school system, that kind of standardized test is just sort of, it almost, I think, is looked down on in the media a little bit, because it seems like, or it gets this impression that it's testing the teachers, right? Because it's actually just saying, here's the curriculum you're supposed to be teaching, and here's how the kids are doing on that curriculum, right? And so then what can happen is that you get teachers who are teaching to that curriculum and not really venturing out, and so it can limit creativity, it can limit a lot of different tools and resources and information that we actually might want our kids to be looking at, but instead they're really held strictly to that curriculum. It doesn't happen a lot. I honestly don't think it happens a lot in Canada, except we do have the provincial exams, but it's really about how those exams are used, how that information is used. That's the problem, not the standardized test itself. It's actually fine for us to have a provincial test and find out kind of where everyone's at, where we are for reading levels, math levels, writing levels, right? But if that information was then used against the school, or somehow used against, the populations that get included in a standardized testing, then there's where we see a lot of problems coming up. And so the issues with standardized tests, I think, are misguided into the label for the standardized test, as opposed to what's actually the concern. Yeah. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, and just building on, like, making sure that the standardized tests that we're using actually are useful. So like when we're doing an assessment here, the results in the standardized testing, we use that along with our clinical expertise to be able to provide recommendations. So our results of the test are really guiding the recommendations for intervention.
Yeah, good point. And a standardized test in our format means that we're comparing, like Ashton said, sorry, both A's. Yeah, both A's. That Ashton said that we're comparing to other kids our age. And so what we're really looking for is, compared to other children, thousands who we have this norm group of, if we're comparing to thousands of other kids, where is your child placing in that comparison? And so typically in those thousands of kids, 50% of them fall in a certain range of scores, and that's why we call that range average. Right? So we're looking, is the child falling in that average range? So are they consistent with 50% of other kids? Or are they falling outside that average range? And so is it something that we either need to work on or encourage and enrich, right? Because it's a strength. So it is different. Yeah, it is a totally different use for us. And the outcomes of those standardized tests aren't being used to inform anything except that child's programming, learning, supports that they can access, that kind of thing. I think another really interesting question that comes up sometimes, and we've only got a few minutes left, but is once I have this report, is it going to be on the kid's permanent file, and does it, is it going to change their program, or do they have to go to special education? Those kinds of questions.
Yeah.
I know for myself, I usually tell parents that the report is your confidential document. So if you're coming through private, if you're doing the assessment through the school system, it's part of their school file, right? So it's already the school's prerogative.
Yeah.
So that's a bit different. But if you're coming through a private agency to get an assessment, then it is your private confidential document, and it's your choice whether you decide to share it. We do encourage sharing because the purpose of the assessment presumably is to be able to access appropriate supports.
Yeah.
And you can't access those supports without a document like that with either a diagnosis or some recommendations directly from the psychologist.
Yeah.
But it's still your choice.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah. I think that is one of the benefits of a private route is it ultimately is your decision what you do with that report. And who you share it with. So even things like sharing it with your doctor, pediatrician as well.
Yeah, true. Yeah, and in some cases you might do that because there might be medication outcomes, right? But again, all choice, right? So doing private is you are in the power seat because you're in control of all the information that's come up.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Any other things that you were thinking of that we didn't touch on? I think we got all the questions.
Yeah,
Oh,
I think we touched.
I have one more. Okay. It's a short one. Okay, we got like a minute and a half. It is, can all therapists diagnose?
So, I would say that for, in terms of the assessments that we're doing, it would depend on that individual therapist's competency. We receive really specialized training in the assessment measures that we use and that we do. And so we would, I think, like to say that that requires a certain level of expertise and knowledge for many of the diagnoses that we provide.
Yeah.
I think lots of therapists, when they're working with a client, they'll often maybe have like a working hypothesis or like a working diagnosis, but they often won't provide like a written statement confirming a diagnosis or something like that. So they might be working with you saying, I think this is what it is, this is what we're going to do. But they probably wouldn't provide a formal diagnosis in most cases.
Yeah, that's a good point. So our tests that we use, all those ones that are standardized, are there's different levels of competency. And level C testing, which is what does the cognitive thinking abilities, you have to have a master's degree at least. You have to have specialist training in those areas. You have to have had supervision and competency on those tests themselves. So as long as the person has that, then they are competent to do it. For diagnosis, everyone has a different comfort level. We specialize in complex and dual diagnoses here, so we are adept at kind of analyzing whether something could be presenting one way when it's actually, something else. And, so just if you're seeing a psychologist, checking in with them and seeing what their comfort level is and distinguishing between, say, ADHD and anxiety or autism and ADHD and, all the different things, whether they're competent and comfortable, if they are able to do learning disability diagnoses, things like that. The word you probably are familiar with is psychoeducational assessment.
Yeah.
And that's where that specialized training in school psychology, or we say assessment psychology, comes in. Clinical psychologists, some of them get that specialized training.
Yeah.
So depending on their background and their training.